My name is Clara Henry. I am 27 years old, and on my wedding day, I sat at the head table in a custom silk gown and watched my mother orchestrate a multi-million-dollar theft against me. For a decade, she treated my career as a senior wealth advisor like a trivial hobby. At the same time, she demanded I use my grandfather's historic trust to fund my sister Savannah's cosmetic dermatology clinic in Boston and my parents' leveraged ski chalets in Aspen. They thought I was their silent and obedient financial safety net. They thought they could drain my accounts while I was distracted listening to wedding toasts. But by the time my sister rushed back into the Cherry Creek Country Club reception 45 minutes later, with her face drained of color, she realized I had just triggered a financial collapse that would erase our family empire before the cake was cut. Before I explain exactly how I legally severed their lifeline, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Morning Revenge. Only do this if you genuinely connect with my story. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from today. I always read your stories. Now let me take you back to the Cherry Creek Country Club right in the middle of my reception, the moment I finally stopped protecting the people who were exploiting me. The clinking of crystal stemware echoed through the grand ballroom. A crisp note temporarily masked the suffocating pretense of my own wedding reception. I sat beside my new husband David, presenting a flawless portrait of rustic luxury to 300 guests. These people were a curated collection of Denver old money and East Coast expats. Beneath the cascading floral arrangements and the low hum of the string quartet, a silent financial execution was underway. My mother, Evelyn, occupied the center of the head table, her designer gown strained slightly against her measured breaths. Evelyn thrived in this high-altitude society, viewing our family as royalty in exile from the Ivy League enclaves of the Northeast. She spent her life worshiping the medical degree Savannah had acquired in Boston. She funded Savannah's aesthetic clinic with the enthusiasm of a devout zealot. Meanwhile, my own career as a private trust attorney was treated like a clerical afterthought. They only acknowledged my skills when they needed a real estate contract reviewed or a tax loophole exploited. I caught the precise moment the heist began. Through the reflection of a silver candelabra, I watched Evelyn tilt her head toward Savannah. The ambient noise of the ballroom provided the perfect cover, but I read Evelyn's lips as they formed the directive. While the guests are toasting, go to the bank. Empty that girl's account before she signs anything. Savannah's lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk. She adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. It was a gift our parents had purchased using equity leveraged against my name. She smoothed her satin bridesmaid dress, grabbed her clutch, and slipped toward the terrace doors under the guise of powdering her nose. David's hand found mine beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. His thumb brushed my knuckles in a grounding rhythm. "She is moving," he murmured. His eyes remained trained on his champagne glass rather than the exiting figure. "Let her," I replied. My voice held the steady, unhurried cadence of a lawyer who already held the signed verdict. Savannah was driving toward the local branch right now, carrying withdrawal slips and an unearned sense of authority. She anticipated a swift 5-minute transaction, wiring millions into Evelyn's offshore holding accounts before the ink on my marriage certificate dried. She had no idea she was walking into a digital snare. 3 days prior, I had severed every financial artery connecting me to them, transferring my inheritance into an ironclad corporate entity in Delaware. Savannah was not about to steal my future. She was about to pull the linchpin on our parents' unsecured debt. I raised my glass as the best man took the microphone, maintaining my placid expression while the clock ticked down on their ruin. Savannah navigating the crowded floor required a practiced, almost theatrical grace. She slid between tables of Denver socialites with a practiced smile while her satin bridesmaid dress caught the warm amber light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. To the casual observer, sipping imported champagne, she was merely a devoted sister stepping away to fix her makeup or handle a minor catering crisis. She nodded to the wives of tech executives, touched the shoulders of old money heirs, and offered polite, hushed greetings as she wove her way toward the heavy oak terrace doors. I did not blink as I watched her. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows flanking the exit, I tracked her progression into the cool evening air. The valet stand stood, illuminated under a wrought iron lantern. Savannah handed over her ticket with an impatient snap of her wrist. She paced the cobblestone driveway while her breath turned visible in the crisp Colorado night. Her manicured fingers tapped a frantic, irregular rhythm against the side of her designer leather clutch. That seemingly minor ripple in the ballroom, disguised as a restroom break, was the catalyst for a profound timeline shift in our family history. As a silver sports car pulled up to the curb and Savannah slid into the driver's seat, I took a slow, deliberate breath. The scent of roasted pheasant truffles and white lilies filled the space around me, yet my mind was miles away, locked inside the subterranean vaults of a Cherry Creek financial institution. The historic trust she was currently rushing to drain was never meant to be a communal slush fund for my parents to pillage. My grandfather built that wealth through decades of grueling logistics contracts and relentless blue-collar labor. He was a pragmatic, grounded man who despised the hollow social climbing my mother treated as a daily religion. When he passed away, he left those assets solely to me. He intended the money to provide an unbreakable bedrock of security for my education and my future independence. He never imagined Evelyn would twist his dying legacy into a financial lifeline for her own reckless vanity and dangerous borrowing habits. For years, my parents treated my inheritance as an endless, unquestionable well of liquidity. Whenever their commercial real estate ventures faced severe margin calls, a mysterious expedited transfer would originate from my account to save them from default. When Savannah decided she needed $250,000 in cutting-edge laser equipment for her boutique aesthetic dermatology clinic in Boston, the funds materialized overnight. They maintained this unyielding control through a toxic combination of emotional manipulation and an outdated custodian clause buried in a stack of banking paperwork. The legal framework was drafted when I was 16 years old, naming Evelyn as the primary signatory under a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. It was a relic of my adolescence. In the strict eyes of the law, that custodial power should have dissolved the very moment I reached adulthood. Evelyn avoided surrendering that power by relying on a private banker who frequently golfed with my father at this very country club. They kept the documentation intentionally murky, burying the ownership details under layers of corporate jargon. They operated on the arrogant assumption that I was too passive, too obedient, and too desperate for their meager affection to ever challenge the arrangement. They thought my silence indicated a pathetic ignorance of my own worth. In reality, my silence was a highly strategic asset. By allowing them to believe they still controlled my wealth, I gave them the false confidence to cross-collateralize their entire investment portfolio. They borrowed millions against my name to fund their luxury ski chalets in Aspen and pay their exclusive membership dues, building a fragile empire of debt on a foundation they no longer owned. From the second table near the dance floor, a subtle movement pulled my attention away from the terrace windows. Aunt Marie raised her glass of sparkling water. Marie is my godmother and a former federal circuit judge. She is a brilliant African-American woman who navigated the ruthless, often unforgiving corridors of the justice system with unparalleled grace and a razor-sharp intellect. Unlike the sycophants filling the rest of the ballroom, Marie saw right through Evelyn and her desperate, transparent posturing. Marie knew the true source of the family wealth. She also knew the depths of the psychological and financial abuse I had endured for years to keep the Henry name printed in local society magazines. Marie wore a tailored emerald suit that stood in stark contrast to the sea of pastel chiffon worn by my mother's country club friends. Her posture was rigid and her expression unreadable to the untrained eye. But we shared a specific visual language forged through years of quiet observation at these suffocating family gatherings. Marie locked eyes with me. A fraction of a millimeter nod followed. It was a silent, powerful confirmation. She knew exactly why Savannah had just abandoned the reception. More importantly, Marie knew about the trap I had spent the last 6 months engineering in secret. The corner of her mouth twitched upward in a rare, fleeting smile before she turned her attention back to the best man stepping up to the microphone. The tension in my chest tightened, spreading a cool, focused wave of adrenaline down my arms. It was not a sensation rooted in fear or hesitation. It was the pure, unadulterated anticipation of a steel jaw snapping shut on an unsuspecting predator. For a decade, my parents patted me on the head and treated my prestigious career as a senior wealth advisor as a convenient mechanism for their own personal gain. They brought me their convoluted tax returns and their failing asset sheets, demanding I fix their careless mistakes, while they openly mocked my lack of elite East Coast prestige. I dutifully managed their wealth accumulation strategies, minimizing their tax liabilities while they reaped all the social benefits. They assumed my legal expertise was a mere tool they owned to serve as a practical extension of their own blind ambition. They were about to learn a devastating lesson about the true nature of private trust law. A wealth advisor is not just a glorified accountant sorting receipts. We are the architects of vast financial ecosystems. We know how to build impenetrable fortresses around vulnerable assets, and more importantly, we know exactly where the structural weaknesses lie in a portfolio built on deceit. I had spent countless late nights mapping every single vulnerability in my parents' leveraged empire. I knew their specific debt-to-equity ratios down to the decimal. I knew the strict covenants of their commercial loans. I knew what would happen the second a flagged transaction hit their primary lending institution. By sending her golden child to the bank during my wedding toast, Evelyn thought she was executing a final, humiliating display of dominance. She wanted to secure her offshore accounts before I signed a marriage certificate that might complicate her unfettered access. She believed she was playing a grand game of chess, maneuvering her pieces to strip me of my resources, while I sat trapped in a white dress, forced to smile for the hired photographers. She was profoundly mistaken. I was not a pawn on her board. I was the one who owned the board, and I had already removed all of her defensive pieces. The orchestra swelled, filling the room with a triumphant chord perfectly matching the quiet victory taking root in my mind as the clock ticked closer to their inevitable ruin. David squeezed my hand under the heavy white linen tablecloth. His thumb traced a slow circle across my knuckles, offering a quiet, grounding rhythm amid the noise of the reception. "Savannah just made a break for it," he whispered. His voice was barely a breath, carrying only to my ear. He kept his eyes trained forward, scanning the exit through his peripheral vision so no one else would notice his observation. I turned my head to look at my new husband, offering a serene, unbothered smile. "Let her," I replied smoothly. My tone carried the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather rather than a multi-million-dollar heist. David was one of the very few people on this earth who understood the genuine depths of my family and their parasitic greed. When we first met, my parents dismissed him because he did not come from an old money lineage or hold a prestigious medical degree from a Boston university. They failed to realize that David possessed a brilliant analytical mind. He worked as an independent actuary calculating risk for international firms. He saw the world in ledgers and probability models. He was immune to the artificial charm Evelyn used to enchant her country club peers. During our courtship, David and I did not spend our evenings attending high society galas or taking vanity trips to the mountains. Instead, we spent countless nights sitting on my living room floor, drinking cheap wine and analyzing the macroeconomic vulnerabilities of the Henry family portfolio. I spread out the balance sheets and the loan documents, showing him the terrifying reality hiding behind my parents' curated public image. He knew every dirty secret they fought so hard to bury. He knew about the cross-collateralized business accounts they used to float their extravagant lifestyle. He knew that the 2 luxury ski chalets in Aspen were leveraged so high that a single missed payment would trigger a catastrophic default. He understood the dangerous debt-to-equity ratio they were hiding from their wealthy friends in Cherry Creek. They projected the image of untouchable billionaires while living month to month on a precipice of borrowed capital. My parents believed they were financial geniuses. They thought their ability to shuffle debt from one holding company to another proved their superiority. David and I mapped their downfall using a single spreadsheet. We calculated exactly how long their empire would survive if they lost access to the historic trust my grandfather left me. The answer was less than 1 week. This minor conflict occurring right now with Savannah sneaking out during the appetizers served as the perfect distraction. Her desperate dash to the bank allowed Evelyn to play the role of the proud, radiant mother here in the ballroom. Evelyn sat 2 chairs away from us, raising a glass of imported champagne and laughing at a joke told by the mayor of Denver. She looked immaculate and entirely oblivious to the fact that her financial empire was built on shifting sand. She thought she had orchestrated a brilliant tactical maneuver. By sending her golden child to drain my accounts during the wedding toasts, she assumed I would be too preoccupied with the celebration to check my banking alerts. She expected me to smile for the cameras and slice the tiered cake while Savannah transferred the bedrock of my future into their offshore accounts. Evelyn operated on the assumption that my legal and financial expertise was inferior to her raw ambition. In her mind, Savannah was the true intellectual heavyweight of the family because she wore a white coat and ran an aesthetic dermatology clinic on the East Coast. Evelyn worshipped the prestige of that medical degree. She viewed my career as a private trust attorney as a dull, unglamorous chore. She thought my job consisted of filing paperwork and fetching tax returns for real wealthy people. She was about to discover the lethal consequences of underestimating a senior wealth advisor. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. As the hired string quartet transitioned into a lively, upbeat sonata, my pulse remained perfectly steady. I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation. I did not even feel anger anymore. Anger is a messy, unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment. I operated with pure clinical detachment. I was not just severing emotional ties today. I was executing a surgical financial amputation. Savannah was the blunt instrument I was using to perform the operation. By walking into that bank and attempting an unauthorized withdrawal, she was pulling the alarm on her own family. She was forcing the banking system to look closely at the fragile structure holding up their debt. David leaned closer, brushing his shoulder against mine. The best man stood up and tapped his spoon against a crystal flute, signaling the start of the speeches. The room quieted down. The soft murmur of Denver elites faded into an expectant silence. "They are going to remember this wedding for decades," David whispered. I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the floral centerpiece in front of me. "Yes, they will," I said softly. Evelyn clapped her hands together, wearing an expression of manufactured delight as the speeches began. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wanted everyone in this room to see a united, prosperous family. She wanted the society photographers to capture her looking like a benevolent matriarch celebrating her youngest daughter. Behind that smile, she was counting the minutes until Savannah sent a text message confirming the money was secured. The irony was poetic. My mother spent her entire life obsessing over outward appearances. She sacrificed my emotional well-being and my financial independence to maintain a hollow shell of prestige. Now she sat in a room full of the most influential people in the state, ignorant to the fact that her entire identity was about to disintegrate in public. The automated security protocols I established days ago were designed to act instantly. When a massive, unauthorized transfer is attempted on a corporate trust, the system does not just decline the transaction, it scrutinizes the origin. It evaluates the linked accounts. It flags the connected entities for immediate manual review. Savannah thought she was turning a key to unlock a vault. In reality, she was detonating a charge at the base of a dam. I felt David squeeze my hand one more time. The warmth of his palm anchored me to the present moment. We had planned for every variable. We anticipated every desperate move Evelyn and Savannah would attempt. We knew they would strike today because they believed the chaos of a wedding provided the perfect cover for a crime. They were right about the chaos. They were just wrong about who was directing it. The best man launched into a heartfelt story about David and our early days of dating. The crowd erupted into warm, polite laughter. Evelyn laughed along with them, her diamond earrings catching the light of the chandeliers. I smiled, taking in the scene. The contrast between the joyful celebration inside this room and the impending financial apocalypse unfolding 5 miles away created a delicious, intoxicating tension. I allowed myself to enjoy the music. I allowed myself to enjoy the taste of the catered food. I allowed myself to feel the profound relief of a woman who was seconds away from cutting a heavy anchor loose. The amputation was underway, and the patient had not even realized they were bleeding out yet. Across town, the heavy double-glass doors of the Cherry Creek Financial Branch slid open, allowing a rush of cool mountain air to sweep across the imported marble floor. Savannah marched into the lobby with the heavy, entitled footsteps of a woman accustomed to blind obedience. She wore her satin bridesmaid dress like a royal garment, brushing past the velvet ropes that guided ordinary customers toward the standard tellers. She ignored the 3 people waiting patiently in the normal queue. Our family had relentlessly exploited this institution for decades, leveraging our supposed high society status to secure unearned privileges and bypass the rules meant for everyone else. Savannah approached the polished mahogany counter reserved exclusively for premium wealth clients. She did not offer a greeting to the staff. She dropped her designer leather clutch onto the wood with a heavy thud and slapped 3 pre-filled withdrawal slips next to it. She leaned forward, demanding a full, immediate wire transfer of my entire trust balance into a specific offshore holding account registered to Evelyn. Savannah carried herself with the untouchable arrogance of a favored golden child. Her entire life was a carefully curated red carpet unrolled by our parents. When she struggled in her demanding undergraduate courses, Evelyn simply hired elite private tutors to guarantee her success. When she decided she wanted to open a high-end aesthetic dermatology clinic in Boston, our father leveraged my inheritance to secure her prime commercial real estate in the most expensive district of the East Coast. She viewed my prestigious law degree as a quaint clerical certification. To her, I was merely the family bookkeeper expected to balance the ledgers and file tax returns while she harvested the social rewards of her medical title. She assumed this bank run would be a minor errand, requiring no more than 5 minutes of her time. The bank teller working the VIP desk was a seasoned professional named Richard. He had serviced the accounts of wealthy Colorado residents for over a decade. He offered a polite, neutral nod, recognizing her face immediately before picking up the slips. His fingers danced across his mechanical keyboard, typing the routing numbers and the historic trust identifiers written in Evelyn's sharp handwriting. Richard hit the enter key, expecting the standard confirmation prompt to generate a wire authorization form. Instead, his monitor froze. A harsh crimson light reflected off his wire-rimmed glasses, illuminating the sudden confusion in his eyes. A stark error code flashed across his screen, blocking any further data entry. The system locked him out of the portal entirely. Savannah crossed her arms over her chest. Her manicured acrylic nails tapped an impatient, erratic rhythm against her bare bicep. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, expecting immediate compliance from the man behind the counter. In her world, delays were reserved for the lower classes. She glanced at the gold watch on her wrist, calculating how fast she could speed back to the country club and resume sipping imported champagne before anyone noticed she was gone. Richard frowned deeply. He pressed a rapid sequence of override keys, but the crimson warning remained locked firmly on his display. He cleared his throat and offered Savannah a practiced apologetic smile. He murmured a quiet request for her patience and raised his hand to signal for the branch manager. The minor annoyance of a routine bank delay quickly escalated into a suffocating systemic blockade. The branch manager, a stern, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Caldwell, emerged from a frosted glass corner office. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket as he approached the premium desk. Richard stepped aside and pointed a shaking finger at the frozen terminal. Caldwell reviewed the code, and his professional demeanor shifted into a state of heightened alert. Savannah leaned over the mahogany counter, invading their designated workspace. She spoke with a sharp, demanding tone, instructing Caldwell to push the wire through instantly or face the wrath of her parents. Her jaw dropped before her eyes narrowed into a fierce glare when Caldwell reached forward and turned the monitor slightly toward her. He lowered his voice, maintaining strict professional boundaries in the open lobby. He explained very clearly that the account she requested no longer existed in its original form. Savannah blinked rapidly. Her mind struggled to process a reality where her demands were denied. She stared at the screen, unable to comprehend the legal terminology glaring back at her. The old signatory clauses granting Evelyn custodial power were gone. The account was empty. The assets had vanished. Her shock rapidly morphed into a defensive rage. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, drawing stares from the tellers and clients alike. She threatened to pull the entire family fortune from their institution tomorrow morning. She weaponized our parents' fabricated wealth, assuming the threat of losing their lucrative business would force Caldwell to bypass federal banking regulations and magically produce her money. She shouted that Evelyn was the legal guardian of the trust and that my permission was not required. Caldwell maintained his calm composure. He informed Savannah that Clara Henry was 27 years old and a licensed private trust attorney. He explained that I had legally dissolved the outdated custodianship earlier that week. Savannah was utterly blind to the terrifying reality hiding beneath the surface of that red error screen. She thought she was simply fighting a bureaucratic glitch. She had no idea she was actively triggering a highly sensitive digital tripwire. I had explicitly coded that exact security protocol into the fraud prevention algorithm of this institution just 3 days prior. When I quietly restructured my assets into an airtight corporate trust registered in Delaware, I did not just move the funds, I laid a trap. I flagged the old routing numbers associated with Evelyn and Savannah. I instructed the banking system to treat any access attempt using those specific credentials as a hostile, unauthorized breach. By slapping those withdrawal slips on the counter and screaming demands at the manager, Savannah was doing my dirty work for me. The bank system was designed to protect high-net-worth clients from theft. When Savannah tried to force a transaction on a dead account linked to her mother's profile, the automated software initiated an immediate security lockdown. The system did not just lock the old trust account, it traced the unauthorized user profile back to Evelyn's primary profile. The algorithm then automatically scanned every single asset, liability, and active credit line associated with our parents' names. For years, my parents had secretly used my historic trust as the underlying collateral to guarantee their heavy commercial loans. They maintained their Aspen chalets, their country club memberships, and Savannah's Boston clinic on a mountain of debt. That debt was propped up solely by the automated verification of my financial presence in their portfolio. When I transferred my assets into the new corporate structure, I legally ceased guaranteeing their loans. The bank simply had not run its quarterly audit yet to discover the missing collateral. They would have eventually noticed next month, giving Evelyn time to scramble and find a new victim to co-sign her debt. But Savannah could not wait. Her desperate wedding day heist forced the system to run an emergency manual audit right now. Caldwell stared at his screen as new windows began popping up one after another. The automated risk assessment software was re-evaluating the collateral standing of the entire family portfolio in real time. The branch manager's eyes widened as the system suddenly recognized that their commercial credit lines were entirely unsecured. The debt-to-income ratios plunged into catastrophic red territory right before his eyes. Savannah continued to yell, demanding respect and threatening lawsuits. She pounded her fist on the mahogany wood, demanding they call the bank president. She was loud and obnoxious and entirely focused on getting her way. She failed to notice the color draining from Caldwell's face as he picked up his desk phone to contact the commercial lending division. The trap had not just snapped shut on my trust account, it had clamped down on the neck of my parents' entire empire. Savannah stood in the lobby throwing a temper tantrum demanding a fortune that no longer existed, while single-handedly setting fire to the fragile house of cards our mother had spent decades building. And I was sitting comfortably at my reception, waiting for the smoke to reach the ballroom. The hired master of ceremonies stepped onto the polished parquet dance floor. He tapped the silver grill of his microphone, producing a soft hum that brought the sprawling ballroom to a gradual hush. The clinking of silverware against fine china faded into a respectful silence. It was time for the parental toasts. Evelyn rose from her seat at the head table, smoothing the front of her designer gown with practiced elegance. She glided toward the center stage, carrying a crystal flute of champagne. She knew exactly how to angle her silhouette to catch the most flattering illumination from the overhead chandeliers. Every single movement my mother made was meticulously calculated. She beamed at the crowd of Denver elites, allowing a perfectly calibrated pause to build anticipation. When she finally spoke, her voice dripped with an artificial warmth that coated the room like expensive syrup. She welcomed the guests and thanked them for gathering in Cherry Creek to celebrate our union. Then she pivoted seamlessly away from my marriage and steered the narrative directly toward her favorite subject, the pristine, unblemished image of the Henry family legacy. Evelyn spoke of our deep Colorado roots, weaving a fabricated tapestry of tradition and unwavering loyalty. She told a charming anecdote about my childhood carefully curated to portray her as a nurturing, fiercely protective matriarch. To the uninitiated guests sipping their drinks, it sounded like a beautiful, heartfelt tribute. To me, it was a masterful display of psychological manipulation. Every poetic pause and every drawn-out syllable served a distinct strategic purpose. She was deliberately running out the clock. She was stalling, buying precious minutes to ensure Savannah had enough time to commit grand larceny across town. I sat perfectly still beside David, keeping a polite, composed smile pinned to my face. I nodded at all the appropriate intervals. While the audience chuckled at Evelyn's rehearsed jokes, my mind operated on a separate track. I watched the hired event photographer crouch near the edge of the stage, lifting his heavy camera to frame the shot. I studied the flawless, professional portrait composition he was constructing. The harsh burst of his flash briefly illuminated the deep lines of tension hiding around my mother's eyes. The shadows cast by the stark lighting captured the hollow deception lurking beneath her foundation. That fleeting contrast between light and dark fascinated me. I had spent my entire professional career analyzing complex structures and searching for hidden liabilities. While Evelyn and Savannah spent their afternoons shopping for imported leather goods, I spent years locked in a quiet office mastering tax optimization and designing automated financial growth models for high-net-worth clients. I learned how to audit sprawling international portfolios and identify the microscopic flaws buried within seemingly perfect corporate systems. I knew how a fraudulent ledger behaved when placed under extreme pressure. A deceptive balance sheet relies on misdirection to survive. It presents a beautiful outward facade while hiding a decaying foundation of bad debt and fabricated assets. As I listened to my mother deliver her captivating speech, I realized her toast was just another flawed system. Her words possessed no underlying equity. The emotional currency she was spending on that stage was entirely counterfeit. She praised my intelligence in one breath, but the compliment rang hollow because her actions always contradicted her public declarations. Behind closed doors, she constantly belittled my career as a senior wealth advisor. She viewed my meticulous financial planning as a dull, pragmatic chore unworthy of the Henry name. She preferred the flashy, undeniable prestige of Savannah's medical degree. She never understood that wealth is not measured by the labels stitched into your clothing or the country club memberships you boast about. True wealth is built on impenetrable legal structures and airtight asset protection. My quiet profession had provided the invisible armor, shielding them from bankruptcy for a decade. Today, I was finally removing that armor. David shifted his weight in his chair, drawing my attention back to the physical world. He did not look at Evelyn. He kept his gaze focused on the floral arrangement adorning our table, but I could feel the coiled energy radiating from his posture. He knew we were sitting in the eye of a hurricane. The calm atmosphere inside this ballroom was temporary. 5 miles away, a digital shockwave was already tearing through the banking servers, preparing to crash into this reception. Evelyn reached the emotional peak of her speech. Her voice trembled right on cue, simulating a wave of overwhelming maternal affection. The guests leaned forward, captivated by her performance. Aunt Marie sat near the dance floor, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. Marie did not smile. Her sharp, judicial eyes remained locked on Evelyn, assessing the theatrical display with cold, accurate judgment. Marie recognized perjury when she heard it. Evelyn turned her body to face me directly. She lifted her crystal flute high into the air, signaling the conclusion of her toast. The room followed her lead, raising hundreds of glasses in a unified salute. Evelyn locked eyes with me, and her warm maternal smile vanished into a rigid, unyielding stare. Her eyes screamed a silent command, demanding my continued submission. That glare carried decades of conditioning. It told me to stay in my place. It ordered me to remain the quiet, obedient daughter who never asked questions while her inheritance was pillaged to fund a Boston aesthetic clinic. I did not break eye contact. I reached for my own glass, wrapping my fingers around the slender stem. I raised it in return, offering her a slow, deliberate toast. I took a measured sip of the champagne. The crisp, dry liquid coated my tongue, masking the bitter taste of her betrayal. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of cheers and enthusiastic applause. The guests drank to our health and happiness, blissfully ignorant of the high-stakes financial warfare occurring right beneath the surface of the imported orchids and silk table runners. They saw a triumphant family celebrating a beautiful union. They did not see the trapdoor swinging open beneath their feet. Evelyn lowered her glass and let out a long, concealed exhale of relief. She believed she had won. She thought she had successfully distracted the room long enough for her golden child to finalize the wire transfer. She assumed the money was already safely tucked away in her offshore accounts beyond my legal reach. She handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies and glided back toward her seat, projecting the aura of a victorious queen. She had no idea she was walking back to a throne made of ashes. The climax was building rapidly, creeping closer second by agonizing second. The automated security protocols at the Cherry Creek branch were already processing the fallout of Savannah's failed heist. The commercial lending division was currently receiving the catastrophic alerts regarding my parents' unsecured loans. The fuse was lit and burning fast. I settled back into my chair, resting my hand on David's knee, waiting for the inevitable explosion to shatter the high-altitude facade once and for all. The air inside the Cherry Creek financial branch felt stagnant and heavy. Savannah stood planted in front of the premium wealth desk, gripping the edge of the mahogany counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She glared at Mr. Caldwell, expecting him to grovel and apologize for the delay. In her Boston dermatology clinic, she was the absolute authority. She was accustomed to barking orders at timid nurses and demanding perfection from her aesthetic technicians. She brought that same clinical arrogance into the bank, expecting financial regulations to bend to her will. Caldwell did not bend. He was a veteran of the banking industry, and he recognized the difference between genuine power and fragile entitlement. He gripped the edges of his monitor and swiveled the screen around to face her. Ms. Henry, we cannot process this withdrawal because Clara Henry is no longer the sole proprietor of these assets, he stated coldly. His voice lacked any trace of the deferential warmth our family usually received. Savannah leaned forward, squinting at the glowing display. She expected to see a simple spelling error or a temporary hold on the funds. Instead, her eyes met a dense wall of complex legal terminology. She stared at the documentation on the screen, her limited financial comprehension struggling to grasp the magnitude of her failure. Savannah spent a decade studying human anatomy, cellular regeneration, and cosmetic laser procedures. She knew how to sculpt a jawline with dermal fillers and how to extract maximum payment from wealthy clients wanting to look 10 years younger. She did not know how to read a corporate ledger. The words on the screen meant nothing to her. She saw terms like irrevocable transfer and fiduciary reallocation blocking her path. She pointed a manicured finger at the display, demanding Caldwell translate the jargon into plain English. Caldwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and explained the situation with brutal clarity. 72 hours ago, Clara legally restructured every cent of that inheritance into an airtight blind corporate trust registered in Delaware. While Evelyn and Savannah were busy picking out floral centerpieces and agonizing over the seating chart for my reception, I was sitting in a sterile boardroom executing a financial masterpiece. I drafted the documents months in advance, waiting for the perfect window of opportunity to strike. 3 days before the wedding, I signed the final digital forms. I removed myself as a direct individual owner of the historic trust. I transferred the entirety of the assets into an automated financial growth model, shielded by the impenetrable corporate privacy laws of Delaware. By changing the fundamental ownership structure of the wealth, I instantly vaporized the legal foundation my mother relied upon. The old signatory clauses granting Evelyn custodial power were rendered void the exact second my ink dried on the Delaware registration. The archaic paperwork Evelyn kept locked in her home safe was now nothing more than useless kindling. The safety net they used to float their luxury lifestyle was gone forever. Savannah shook her head, rejecting the reality standing right in front of her. She insisted there was a mistake. She raised her voice, echoing through the quiet lobby, declaring that Evelyn was the primary custodian and that Clara lacked the legal authority to move the money without parental consent. Caldwell offered a polite but firm correction. He reminded Savannah that Clara Henry was a 27-year-old senior wealth advisor who passed the bar exam in the top tier of her class. He stated that the original custodial arrangement expired years ago and that the bank was legally bound to honor the new corporate registration. The color began to drain from Savannah's face. The arrogant flush in her cheeks faded into a pale, sickly hue as the truth slowly penetrated her stubborn ego. She realized she could not bully her way past a federal banking regulation. She could not threaten Caldwell with a bad review or a stern phone call from our father. The money was inaccessible. Her Boston clinic would not receive the cash injection she desperately needed to cover her upcoming payroll and equipment leases. But the true horror of the situation was not just the sudden lack of liquidity. The missing funds were only the surface layer of the catastrophe. The real danger lay buried deep within the banking software itself. When I designed the Delaware Corporate Trust, I included a very specific digital tripwire. I knew my mother would eventually send someone to the bank to drain the account. I anticipated the exact method they would use. I knew they would attempt the transfer using Evelyn's outdated user profile. By trying to force a wire transaction on a dead account linked directly to her mother's profile, Savannah was categorized by the banking system as a hostile, unauthorized actor. She triggered a secondary automated protocol built into the core architecture of the financial institution. Banks operating at this level of wealth management do not take unauthorized access attempts lightly. When a user tries to move millions of dollars from a restricted account, the system instantly throws a defensive shield over every single asset connected to that user. Caldwell's terminal flashed again. The red error code regarding my trust vanished, replaced by a cascading series of yellow warning windows. Savannah watched in stunned silence as the alerts multiplied across the screen. The bank's automated risk assessment software awakened from its dormant state. It began a ruthless, real-time audit of Evelyn and my father's entire financial portfolio. For years, my parents had presented themselves as titans of Colorado real estate. They boasted about their Aspen ski chalets, their commercial properties, and their exclusive country club memberships. What they never disclosed to their high society friends was the terrifying amount of debt keeping those properties afloat. They cross-collateralized every single loan they held. They used the equity from one property to secure the mortgage on another, creating a fragile, towering house of cards. At the very bottom of that towering deck, acting as the foundational anchor, was my historic trust. They used my grandfather's money as the ultimate guarantee for their commercial credit lines. As long as the bank saw millions of dollars sitting in an account bearing the Henry name, the risk assessment algorithms remained satisfied. Now the anchor was gone. Savannah's unauthorized withdrawal attempt forced the system to look closely at the foundation. The software instantly recognized that the Delaware Corporate Trust no longer belonged to the Henry family portfolio. It belonged to an independent entity that carried no obligation to cover Evelyn's debts. Caldwell stared at the screen as the software recalculated the collateral standing of the entire family empire. The numbers plummeted. The required debt-to-equity ratios demanded by the commercial lending division were shattered in a matter of seconds. The system realized that my parents were holding millions of dollars in outstanding loans with zero liquid collateral backing them up. Savannah demanded to know what the yellow warning boxes meant. She slammed her palm against the mahogany wood, demanding Caldwell stop the flashing alerts and give her the money. She thought she was still fighting for her own Boston clinic. She had no idea she had just commanded a digital firing squad to aim directly at our parents. Caldwell did not answer her immediately. He typed a rapid sequence of commands into his keyboard, trying to halt the automated audit. It was useless. The protocol was hardwired into the federal compliance system. Once the risk assessment software identified an unsecured liability, it was required by law to take immediate protective action. The branch manager slowly looked up from his monitor. The polite customer service facade he maintained for the past decade vanished. He looked at Savannah not as a premium VIP client, but as a financial liability standing in his lobby. He informed her that the secondary protocol had locked the system. He stated that the commercial lending division was currently receiving emergency notifications regarding the unsecured status of the Henry family portfolio. Savannah's jaw dropped. Her limited understanding of finance finally grasped the edge of the cliff she had just sprinted over. She knew our parents relied on credit to survive. She knew the Aspen chalets were mortgaged to the hilt. She realized that by poking the bear to steal my money, she had woken the beast that held their entire livelihood in its jaws. The tension in the bank lobby reached a boiling point. Savannah stood frozen, her manicured nails digging into the expensive leather of her clutch. She was no longer the arrogant golden child demanding her unearned inheritance. She was a panicked, frantic accomplice who just realized she left her fingerprints all over the murder weapon. The conflict at the bank had evolved from a simple denied transaction into a systemic financial meltdown. The automated audit was running its course, severing the fragile threads holding the Henry empire together. Caldwell picked up his desk phone, pressing the direct extension for the regional commercial lending director. Savannah watched his finger hit the button, knowing that every second that passed brought our parents closer to absolute ruin. And back at the country club, the dessert plates were just being served. This hidden pebble was the precise mechanism designed to trigger the avalanche. For 5 long years, my parents operated a financial illusion built entirely on my quiet submission. They secretly used my historic trust as the underlying collateral to guarantee their sprawling commercial loans. To the outside world, Evelyn and my father were real estate visionaries. They maintained 2 luxury ski chalets in Aspen and funded a lavish Cherry Creek lifestyle that required a constant heavy influx of cash. They drove imported vehicles and hosted high society charity galas, all while standing on a mountain of high-interest debt. That debt was propped up by a single load-bearing pillar: my enforced financial presence. They pledged the millions sitting in my grandfather's trust as the ultimate safety net for their borrowing. As long as the bank saw my assets sitting adjacent to their liabilities, their credit score remained pristine. They enjoyed prime interest rates and limitless borrowing power because the bank believed they had the cash reserves to back up their risky investments. When I restructured my assets into the Delaware Corporate Trust 72 hours ago, I did not merely move my money. I legally revoked my status as their financial guarantor. I severed the invisible tether keeping their hot air balloon from crashing into the ground. The bank system, however, operates on scheduled routines. The automated risk assessment software simply had not run its regular quarterly audit yet. The servers were scheduled to review the collateral standing of all premium accounts at the end of the month. If Savannah had stayed at the wedding and ignored our mother's greedy whisper, my parents would have enjoyed 2 more weeks of artificial wealth before the system caught their exposure. But Savannah could not wait. Her frantic, unauthorized attempt to wire those funds out of a debt account flagged their entire portfolio for an immediate manual review. She forced the system to look under the hood of our parents' financial engine right this very second. Inside the bank lobby, the polished mahogany counter seemed to shrink as the digital catastrophe unfolded on Mr. Caldwell's monitor. The branch manager watched the automated software ruthlessly dissect the Henry family accounts. The system rapidly decoupled my Delaware trust from Evelyn's profile. Once that artificial padding vanished, the true nature of their finances was exposed to the harsh light of institutional scrutiny. Caldwell stared at the screen as the commercial credit lines recalculated their standing in real time. Without my trust acting as a buffer, the Henry family loans were instantly classified as unsecured. The software generated a cascading list of margin calls and covenant breaches. The debt-to-income ratios plunged deep into catastrophic red digits. The algorithms quickly determined that my parents owed the bank a sum of money they had no mathematical way of repaying. Savannah stood paralyzed on the opposite side of the counter. The ambient hum of the bank lobby seemed to fade into a ringing silence in her ears. Her limited medical background offered her no defense against the cold binary logic of banking software. She spent her entire adulthood believing that our parents possessed an infinite well of wealth. She assumed the Aspen chalets and her Boston dermatology clinic were paid for in cash born from our father's supposed business genius. Looking at the flashing red error codes reflecting in Caldwell's wire-rimmed glasses, Savannah finally understood the fragile illusion of her own existence. She realized her lavish life was entirely dependent on my forced servitude. She was not an independent, successful doctor immune to the struggles of normal people. She was a financial parasite, feeding off a host that had just detached itself. The arrogance that fueled her grand entrance into the bank evaporated. Her manicured hands trembled as she gripped her designer purse. She tried to formulate a demand or a threat to force the manager to obey her, but her throat felt coated in sand. The realization of her own vulnerability stripped away her voice. She watched Caldwell type a final sequence of keys confirming the system override. Mr. Caldwell did not look at Savannah with anger. He looked at her with the cold, professional detachment of an auditor examining a ruined ledger. His fiduciary duty belonged to the bank, and the bank had just discovered an unsecured liability bleeding across its records. Protocol dictated a swift and merciless response to protect the institution. He reached across his desk and picked up the heavy black receiver of his telephone. Savannah watched his fingers dial the internal extension for the commercial lending division. Every press of a button sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. She knew enough to understand that once the lending division was alerted, the situation would leave local branch control and enter the hands of corporate liquidators. Caldwell spoke into the receiver, his voice a low, even baritone that offered no room for negotiation. He identified his branch number and provided the routing prefix for the Henry family portfolio. He informed the lending director that a critical collateral failure had just been verified by the automated risk assessment software. He requested an immediate global freeze on all connected business accounts to prevent capital flight. Savannah heard the words "global freeze" and felt her knees buckle slightly. The polished marble floor beneath her designer heels felt as though it were tilting. She reached out to steady herself against the mahogany counter. The trap had not just snapped shut on my historic trust. It had clamped down on the neck of our parents' entire empire, and it was suffocating them in real time. The freeze meant that every single credit card connected to their business accounts would be declined instantly. It meant the operating funds for the Aspen properties were locked away. It meant the payroll accounts for Savannah's aesthetic clinic in Boston were frozen solid. They could not move a single dollar or pay a single vendor without explicit authorization from a corporate bankruptcy officer. She stood in the lobby as the architect of her own destruction. If she had simply stayed at the wedding and eaten her dinner, the avalanche would have remained suspended on the mountain for a few more weeks. Her greed and Evelyn's urgent command had triggered the collapse today. While Savannah gasped for air in the sterile bank lobby, I was sitting at my wedding reception holding a silver dessert fork. The catering staff was gracefully delivering plates of vanilla bean cake to the guest tables. The string quartet was playing a soft romantic melody that floated above the gentle chatter of Denver society. David leaned back in his chair, observing the room with a relaxed, genuine smile. He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. He did not need to ask me what was happening across town. We had modeled this exact sequence of events on a spreadsheet 3 months ago. We knew the precise timeline of a commercial banking freeze down to the minute. I sliced a small piece of cake and brought it to my lips. The sweet taste of buttercream stood in sharp contrast to the bitter financial execution I was orchestrating. I felt no guilt over their impending ruin. I felt the profound lightness of a woman who had spent a decade carrying the weight of a parasitic family, only to finally set that burden down. The guests at the Cherry Creek Country Club continued to laugh and celebrate, unaware that the wealthy, influential family hosting this lavish event was currently bankrupt. Evelyn was sitting just a few feet away, chatting with a local politician, projecting the image of an untouchable matriarch. She had no idea her credit lines were severed. She had no idea her golden child was currently standing in a bank lobby, watching their fabricated legacy burn to the ground. The automated systems were fast, but human communication always introduces a slight delay. Savannah would need a moment to collect her shattered nerves before she could dial her phone. The bank would need a few minutes to issue the formal electronic notices of default to the account holders. We were sitting in the quiet, heavy space between the lightning strike and the thunderclap. I set my fork down and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, waiting for the first phone to ring. Panic is a remarkably quiet emotion when it first enters the human nervous system. It does not announce itself with a loud, dramatic scream. It arrives as a sudden, paralyzing cold that settles deep within the chest, constricting the lungs and numbing the extremities. Savannah stumbled out of the heavy glass doors of the Cherry Creek Financial Branch, pushing her weight against the frame just to keep her balance. The crisp Colorado mountain air bit into her exposed shoulders, but the chilling wind did nothing to cool the sudden, terrifying sweat forming along her hairline. She was accustomed to environments she could entirely control. Her Boston dermatology clinic was a sanctuary of sterile predictability, where her demands were law. Standing on the cobblestone pavement outside the bank, she was stripped of her authority. She felt the heavy, crushing weight of the commercial lending freeze pressing down on her reality. Her designer heels scraped clumsily against the concrete as she paced the sidewalk. She reached into her imported leather clutch, pulling out her smartphone with hands shaking so severely she lost her grip on her keyring. The metal keys slipped from her fingers and hit the pavement with a sharp clattering sound that echoed down the quiet evening street. Savannah stared at the glowing screen of her device, ignoring the dropped keys. She frantically tapped our mother's contact icon, pressing the phone tight against her ear. She listened to the hollow rhythmic ringing tone. Every single ring felt like a physical blow to her ribcage. She needed Evelyn to answer the call immediately. She needed the matriarch to fix this unprecedented disaster. Savannah fully expected her mother to pick up the line and deploy some hidden legal maneuver to reverse the catastrophic institutional audit. She had spent her entire life believing Evelyn was invincible. 5 miles away, inside the opulent grand ballroom of the Cherry Creek Country Club, the atmosphere remained drenched in artificial warmth. We were lingering at the head table while the catering staff moved silently around us, pouring fresh wine and clearing the final plates. Evelyn sat entirely absorbed in her own curated reality. Her diamond-encrusted phone rested inside a small beaded clutch sitting inches from her silverware. The device began to vibrate, emitting a low, muffled buzz against the heavy white linen tablecloth. I watched my mother from the corner of my eye. Evelyn paused her conversation and lowered her gaze toward the vibrating clutch. She recognized the custom ringtone she had assigned to Savannah. A fleeting look of immense satisfaction washed over her carefully contoured face. She assumed the incoming call was a victorious confirmation. She truly believed her golden child was simply checking in to report that my historic trust had been successfully drained and wired to an offshore destination. Instead of answering the call, Evelyn chose her public image over her conspiring daughter. She was seated next to the mayor of Denver. He was a prominent political figure she had spent 6 months courting to secure a favorable zoning permit for an upcoming real estate development. The mayor was in the middle of delivering a lengthy, humorous anecdote about a recent golfing trip to Scotland. Interrupting his story to take a phone call would represent a severe breach of high-altitude social etiquette. Evelyn craved the validation of the political elite far more than she cared about confirming her financial heist. She deliberately ignored the call. She let the device buzz itself into silence. She picked up her crystal glass and took a slow, elegant sip of her vintage Pinot Noir. She offered the mayor a bright, melodic laugh that sounded remarkably like shattering glass. She wanted to maintain her strict position as the attentive, high society hostess, projecting an aura of effortless grace to everyone in the room. She was blissfully unaware of the rapidly expanding financial chasm tearing her world apart. Back on the cold pavement, Savannah heard the automated voicemail greeting. The robotic voice informed her that Evelyn was currently unavailable. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through Savannah's stomach. She pulled the phone away from her face, staring at the digital display in pure disbelief. Evelyn never ignored her calls. As the favored sibling, she possessed a direct, unhindered line to our mother's immediate attention. This rejection felt alien and terrifying. Survival instinct took over, and she tapped the icon to dial again. The phone buzzed a second time on the head table. Evelyn's smile tightened slightly, indicating her growing annoyance. The interruption was becoming a nuisance to her performance. She casually shifted her thick cloth napkin over the beaded clutch to dampen the vibrating sound. She leaned closer to the mayor, hanging on his every word, to prove her undivided attention. Savannah called a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth. The digital assault continued without a single pause. Savannah paced the sidewalk, leaving her keys abandoned on the ground. She was practically hyperventilating, taking shallow, rapid gasps of the thin mountain air. Her extensive medical training offered no diagnostic cure for the complete evaporation of her net worth. She was trained to heal skin, not salvage a ruined credit portfolio. 9 missed calls accumulated on the dark screen of Evelyn's phone. 9 desperate digital pleas from a daughter realizing she was holding the bag in a massive federal bank fraud scheme. The tension in the narrative had completely shifted away from the technical execution of my legal trap. The automated wealth models and the Delaware corporate structures had performed their duties flawlessly. The focus now rested entirely on the raw psychological breakdown of my abusers. I sat silently beside David, observing this magnificent cognitive disconnect. The geographic distance between the two women was short, but their mental realities were light years apart. Savannah was drowning in the freezing waters of institutional bankruptcy. Evelyn was floating on a warm cloud of Pinot Noir and political flattery. I did not need to lift a finger or raise my voice to orchestrate their mutual destruction. Their own toxic dynamic was performing the heavy lifting for me. David noticed the persistent vibrating under Evelyn's napkin. He shifted his gaze toward me, raising a single dark eyebrow. His sharp, analytical mind registered the high frequency of the incoming calls. He knew exactly who was on the other end of the line and what news she carried. He reached for his water glass, masking a quiet, knowing smirk behind the crystal rim. We were sitting in the front row, witnessing the exact moment the parasite realized the host had died. The Colorado wind whipped Savannah's hair across her face, ruining the expensive salon styling she received that morning. She clutched the phone with both hands, pressing the device so hard against her ear that the screen bruised her cheek. The automated voicemail picked up for the 9th consecutive time. Savannah let out a raw, guttural sound into the empty street. The noise was entirely devoid of her usual refined Boston accent. She looked back at the glass doors of the bank. The security guard was watching her from the lobby with his hand resting cautiously near his radio. She realized she looked like a deranged trespasser in a financial institution that no longer recognized her family name. She scrambled to pick up her keys from the pavement, scraping her manicured nails against the rough concrete. One of her acrylic tips snapped off, leaving a jagged, painful edge. She did not care. Her vanity was completely overridden by sheer terror. She unlocked her silver sports car and threw herself into the driver's seat. She slammed the heavy door, shutting out the cold wind, but locking herself inside a rapidly shrinking reality. She jammed the key into the ignition and turned it with trembling fingers. If Evelyn refused to answer the phone, Savannah would have to deliver the catastrophic news in person. At the head table, Evelyn finally checked her screen. The mayor had turned his attention to a passing waiter to request another drink, providing a brief window of privacy. Evelyn pulled the phone from beneath the napkin and saw the 9 missed call notifications. A brief flicker of genuine irritation crossed her features. She assumed Savannah had encountered a minor traffic delay or a trivial paperwork issue requiring an electronic signature. Evelyn typed a quick, dismissive text message, telling her daughter to stop calling and handle the minor situation quietly. She pressed send and dropped the phone back into the bag, fully satisfied with her own authority. She took another bite of her expensive meal, savoring the rich, savory flavor. She sat in the center of the ballroom, radiating power and prestige, entirely unaware that her desperate daughter was currently tearing down the mountain highway, bringing the Grim Reaper directly to her front door. The reception moved seamlessly into the dessert course, creating an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility. A small army of catering staff emerged from the swinging kitchen doors, carrying silver trays loaded with elaborate confections. They moved with practiced synchronicity, placing plates of dark chocolate mousse adorned with edible gold leaf in front of the chatting guests. The clattering of dinner forks gave way to the soft scrape of dessert spoons. The hired string quartet transitioned from lively sonatas into a slow, romantic ballad that wrapped the ballroom in a velvet layer of calm. The guests leaned back in their chairs, loosening their silk ties and draping pashminas over their shoulders. The earlier tension generated by the parental toasts faded into a pleasant, ambient hum of society gossip and shared laughter. Denver elites discussed their upcoming winter trips and their pending corporate mergers. To the untrained eye, this was the pinnacle of a successful high society wedding. It was a beautiful, flawless evening celebrating love and prosperity. I knew this relaxation was a deliberate pacing choice orchestrated by the universe itself. It served as a necessary psychological lull before an explosive finale. Aunt Marie stood up from her table near the dance floor. She smoothed the front of her tailored emerald suit and walked toward the head table with the slow, purposeful stride of a woman who commanded respect without asking for it. Her sharp, discerning gaze swept across the sprawling ballroom, taking inventory of the oblivious crowd before her eyes finally settled on me. She bypassed Evelyn entirely, refusing to acknowledge my mother's triumphant posture. Marie stopped behind my chair, resting one hand gently on the carved wooden backrest. She leaned down so her voice would not travel beyond our immediate circle. "She is late," Marie murmured. Her voice was a low, comforting hum that cut through the noise of the string quartet. I kept my eyes forward, watching the event photographer adjust his lighting umbrella near the ice sculpture. "She is," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Marie tilted her head slightly, observing the empty seat where my sister was supposed to be sitting. Savannah should have returned 30 minutes ago. She only needed to drive 5 miles down the road, sign a single withdrawal slip, and drive back. The fact that she was currently missing meant she had encountered an immovable obstacle. "You pulled the pin, did you not?" Clara Marie asked softly. I turned my head to look at my godmother. I did not offer a lengthy explanation or a dramatic monologue. I simply gave her a single, definitive nod. Marie smiled. It was not the artificial, polite smile Evelyn wore for the cameras. It was a genuine, profound expression of pride that reached all the way to the corners of her eyes. She squeezed the back of my chair once more, transferring a silent wave of unwavering support before turning around and returning to her seat. Marie knew the truth about the Henry family long before I possessed the vocabulary to articulate it. During her 20 years serving on the federal bench, she presided over hundreds of fraud cases involving wealthy, desperate families. She knew how white-collar criminals operated, and she recognized those same toxic traits in her own sister. Marie knew the quiet abuse I had endured since childhood. She knew about the countless late nights I spent locked in my home office, untangling my parents' deliberate financial sabotage. While Savannah spent her 20s traveling to European wellness retreats, I spent my nights auditing forged balance sheets and restructuring bad debt to keep the family out of federal court. Evelyn treated me like a human calculator, assuming my loyalty was an endless resource she could exploit indefinitely. Marie was the only person who pulled me aside and told me that my brilliant legal mind was a weapon I could eventually use to cut myself free. The romantic ballad swelled, filling the room with a sweeping cello solo. I reached for my water glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. I checked the discreet smartwatch strapped to my left wrist. The digital face displayed the time in crisp white numerals. It was exactly 42 minutes past 8 o'clock in the evening. My mind shifted away from the music and the decadent desserts. I began calculating the precise journey of a digital data packet traveling through a modern banking mainframe. The commercial lending division at any major financial institution operates with ruthless efficiency, especially concerning high liability accounts. They do not wait for the next business day to address a critical collateral failure. When the automated risk assessment software identified that my parents' commercial credit lines were entirely unsecured, the system would flag the portfolio for an emergency freeze. Human intervention at the branch level might slow the process down by a few minutes, but Mr. Caldwell possessed a strict fiduciary duty to report the breach. Once he dialed the lending director and confirmed the missing trust assets, the corporate liquidators would take the reins. I knew the algorithm powering their specific bank because I had studied it extensively during my tenure as a wealth advisor. The software utilizes an automated communication protocol to notify account holders of a catastrophic default. The moment the global freeze is initiated, the system generates a batch of urgent electronic notices. Those notices do not travel through the Postal Service. They are dispatched instantly via encrypted emails and automated text messages directly to the primary account holders' smartphones. If my calculations on modern banking algorithms were correct, those automated default notices would be issuing right about now. I shifted my gaze across the ballroom, searching for my father. He was standing near the terrace doors, holding a fresh glass of bourbon and laughing uproariously with a prominent real estate developer. My father carried the exact same arrogant aura as my mother. He believed his superficial charm and his tailored tuxedo provided an impenetrable shield against the consequences of his reckless borrowing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, presumably to check a sports score or reply to an investor. The tension inside my chest morphed into a sharp, hyper-focused clarity. I watched his thumb swipe across the screen. The storm was no longer gathering on the horizon. The dark clouds had reached the perimeter of the country club. Savannah was currently trapped inside a silver sports car, hurtling back toward the reception, carrying the physical confirmation of their failure. The banking servers were simultaneously routing a barrage of electronic death sentences to every device registered under the Henry name. The sheer beauty of the trap resided in its inescapable nature. My parents could not negotiate their way out of an automated algorithm. They could not charm a computer server. They could not leverage their high society status to override a federal banking regulation. The financial laws I dedicated my life to mastering were cold, objective, and fiercely unforgiving. David leaned his shoulder against mine, breaking my intense concentration. He picked up his dessert spoon and tapped it lightly against the edge of his plate. "The timeline is converging," he noted quietly. I checked my smartwatch one more time, watching the minute turn. "Yes, it is," I replied. Evelyn was still sitting a few feet away, chatting amiably with the mayor. She took another delicate bite of her chocolate mousse, savoring the rich flavor. She looked remarkably peaceful sitting upon her fabricated throne. She believed she had executed a flawless victory, securing her wealth and neutralizing my independence on the very day of my wedding. She assumed tomorrow would bring another day of endless luxury funded by my stolen inheritance. She remained entirely oblivious to the silent digital alarm screaming across the banking network. The romantic music continued to play, lulling the entire room into a false sense of security. The high-altitude facade held strong for a few more fleeting seconds. I set my glass down and folded my hands in my lap, waiting for the first crack to appear in the marble. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom did not merely open. They yielded to a frantic, desperate push, hitting the polished brass wall stoppers with a dull, resonant thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The hired string quartet stationed near the ice sculpture continued playing their slow, romantic ballad. Their bows glided across the cello strings, maintaining the elegant, soothing tempo. Yet the conversations closest to the entryway evaporated in an instant. A sudden, localized silence bloomed at the back of the room as heads turned and crystal dessert plates were lowered back to the tables. Savannah stood in the doorway. The visual contrast she presented against the backdrop of the lavish reception was jarring. Just an hour ago, she had been the picture of East Coast medical prestige, radiating untouchable confidence. Now, her perfectly styled hair hung in chaotic, damp strands around her face. Her breathing arrived in shallow, erratic gasps, causing the expensive satin fabric of her bridesmaid dress to heave with every panicked inhalation. The rich, vibrant color that usually warmed her cheeks had vanished entirely. Her complexion now matched the stark, pristine ivory of my custom silk wedding gown. She resembled a hollow apparition haunting the perimeter of her own curated life. She did not care about the optics. She possessed zero regard for the high society judgment emanating from the surrounding tables. The wealthy enclaves of Denver usually demanded strict adherence to decorum. A woman of her standing was expected to maintain composure regardless of the internal crisis. But survival instinct had swallowed her ego whole. She stepped onto the polished hardwood and began to sprint. The sharp staccato clicks of her designer heels echoed like rapid gunfire over the melodic music. She bypassed the guest tables with a reckless, untamed momentum. She ignored the bewildered stares of our country club peers. An heir to a local telecommunications fortune had to step back, abruptly spilling a drop of red wine on his tuxedo shirt just to avoid a collision. The mayor of Denver ceased his political posturing, blinking in sheer confusion as the frantic doctor tore through his pristine environment. I sat next to David, watching her rapid approach with clinical fascination. Growing up, Savannah was shielded from every consequence. If she failed a university exam, Evelyn simply wrote a check to an elite private tutor and erased the academic blemish. If she overspent her credit limit, our father quietly transferred funds to hide the deficit. Savannah only knew how to deliver victories and collect unearned praise. She had never been forced to carry the weight of a catastrophic failure. Carrying that burden now was physically breaking her apart, right in front of my eyes. Evelyn saw her golden child charging toward the head table. The polite, warm smile adorning my mother's face finally shattered. It did not fade away gracefully. It cracked and collapsed, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl of maternal reprimand. Evelyn despised public displays of raw emotion. In her rigid worldview, losing control in front of the Cherry Creek elite was a sin far worse than actual financial ruin. She believed that as long as the facade remained intact, any problem could be buried beneath lawyers and quiet settlements. Evelyn stood up so fast her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the parquet floor. She abandoned her engaging conversation with the mayor, leaving him mid-sentence with a stunned expression. She stepped out from behind the linen-draped table, intercepting Savannah before she could reach the elevated center stage. My mother operated on the assumption that she could still bully the narrative into submission. She thought she could contain the blast radius by simply forcing the explosive element out of sight. She reached out and grabbed Savannah by the upper arm. It was not a gentle, comforting touch meant to soothe a distressed child. It was a fierce, punishing grip designed to inflict quiet, physical pain. I recognized that specific hold immediately. During our childhood, Evelyn used that exact physical maneuver to drag us into empty hallways whenever our behavior threatened her flawless public image. Her fingernails dug into the soft satin fabric, trying to yank Savannah toward the discreet service corridor located behind the kitchen doors. "Keep your voice down," Evelyn hissed. Her tone was a venomous, tight whisper meant only for her daughter's ears. "What on earth is wrong with you? People are staring at us. Fix your face right now and walk with me." 10 years ago, Savannah would have obeyed that command without hesitation. She would have swallowed her rising panic, buried her terror, and marched into the shadows to protect the Henry legacy. She was programmed to protect the mothership at all costs. But tonight, the legacy was already dead. The mothership was currently sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Savannah ripped her arm away from Evelyn's punishing grasp. The sudden, forceful motion shocked my mother, causing her to stumble backward half a step. Evelyn's eyes widened in genuine disbelief. The physical rebellion was unprecedented. Savannah had never struck back. She had never defied a direct physical command from the woman who funded her entire existence. Savannah stood her ground, shaking from head to toe. Her throat constricted as she fought against the immense gravity of the words she needed to speak. She did not whisper. She lacked the lung capacity to modulate her volume, and she lacked the mental bandwidth to care who was listening. Her voice tore through the ambient noise of the ballroom, carrying a raw, trembling pitch that commanded the attention of every guest seated in the first 3 rows. "Mom, the account." Savannah gasped, struggling to draw enough oxygen to form a coherent sentence. "It is gone! The trust account is gone!" Evelyn froze. Her furious scowl faltered, replaced by a dangerous blank confusion. The concept of the money missing simply did not compute in her brain. She had orchestrated the heist perfectly. She sent her most trusted asset to a bank manager they had intimidated for years. The transaction was supposed to be a mere formality. "What do you mean, gone?" Evelyn demanded. Her own volume began to slip, rising above the threshold of a whisper. The string quartet music swelled, trying to cover the escalating confrontation, but the guests were already leaning forward, captivated by the unfolding drama. Aunt Marie set her water glass down, her dark eyes locked on the imploding duo. Savannah shook her head. Tears finally spilled over her dark lashes, ruining her expensive cosmetic application and leaving dark streaks down her pale cheeks. Clara moved it all. "The legal structure you told me to use is void. They laughed at me, Mom. The bank manager would not even process the paper." David squeezed my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the flawless execution. The first phase of the truth had been delivered. Now came the fatal blow. "But that is not the worst part," Savannah continued. She drew one last ragged breath, delivering the lethal strike that would end their reign over Denver society. She took a step closer to Evelyn, as if proximity could somehow soften the blow. The bank system flagged the old routing numbers. By trying to withdraw the funds, I tripped their security protocols. They are freezing everything, Mom. Evelyn stopped breathing. Her rigid posture went entirely slack. The commercial loans, Savannah cried out, her voice echoing across the floral centerpieces, the credit lines for the Aspen properties, the operating accounts for my clinic. The manager called the commercial lending division while I was standing right there in the lobby. All of it is frozen right now. We have nothing. The words hung in the warm air, slicing through the remaining pretense of the wedding reception. The financial execution I orchestrated in the quiet shadows of my legal office had officially breached the surface. The invisible trap had sprung, catching its prey in the most public forum imaginable. My mother stood under the glow of the crystal chandeliers, exposed and stripped of her armor. The quiet panic was over. A loud, messy public reckoning had just begun taking root on the dance floor. Evelyn stood entirely frozen. The polished veneer she spent decades applying to her personality cracked apart in a single agonizing second. She heard the words Savannah cried out, but her brain refused to process the concept of failure. She looked at her older daughter with a mixture of sheer disgust and rising terror. "Keep your voice down," Evelyn hissed. She pushed the command through clenched teeth, assuming her hushed tone would contain the damage. But she severely misjudged the acoustics of the Cherry Creek Country Club ballroom. In the sudden quiet of the room, that venomous whisper carried across the imported floral arrangements and bounced off the vaulted ceiling. Everyone in the first 3 rows heard her desperate attempt to silence the truth. The mayor set his crystal glass on the table with a sharp clink that echoed like a gavel strike. I knew the time for quiet observation had officially expired. I placed my linen napkin on the table next to my untouched dessert plate. I stood up from my chair, pushing it back with a slow, deliberate motion. My custom silk wedding gown caught the bright amber light of the overhead chandeliers, shimmering as I stepped out from behind the head table. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, confident stride of a private trust attorney entering a federal courtroom to deliver a closing argument. "She means the corporate trust structure," I said clearly. My voice did not shake. It carried a projected, unshakable authority that cut straight through the heavy tension blanketing the dance floor. I did not raise my volume to match Savannah's frantic yelling. True power does not require screaming. It only requires absolute, unyielding certainty. I stopped a few feet away from where my mother and sister stood locked in their panicked embrace. I looked directly into Evelyn's wide, calculating eyes. "I restructured the historic account 72 hours ago," I stated. "I removed my name from your portfolio. You are no longer signatories, and you no longer have collateral." The sprawling ballroom descended into a suffocating silence. The hired string quartet finally realized a catastrophic family rupture was occurring right in front of them. The cellist lifted his bow from the strings, bringing the romantic ballad to a sudden, jarring halt. The absence of music made the room feel impossibly small. 300 of the most influential people in Colorado sat perfectly still, holding their collective breath. Denver society thrived on polite, passive-aggressive gossip, but they were currently witnessing a raw, unmasked execution. Evelyn spun toward me, releasing her vice grip on Savannah's arm. The mask of the loving, radiant mother completely dissolved. The elegant posture she maintained for the cameras collapsed into a rigid, aggressive stance. Her face contorted, twisting into a portrait of raw, panicked malice. The artificial warmth she used to charm the country club elite vanished, revealing the hollow, greedy core hiding underneath.
"What have you done, Clara?"
she shrieked. She forgot the audience entirely. She forgot the mayor sitting 10 feet away. She forgot the event photographer capturing her meltdown in high definition. "We needed that liquidity for the Aspen development." Her outburst exposed the absolute truth of our family dynamic to everyone in the room. She did not express sorrow for ruining my wedding day. She did not apologize for orchestrating a massive theft during my reception. Her only concern was the real estate project she used to inflate her social currency. For years, she forced me to manage the legal compliance for that specific Aspen property. It was a sprawling luxury chalet project built entirely on high-interest mezzanine debt. She treated my legal expertise as a free in-house service, constantly demanding I manipulate the tax codes to hide their dangerous financial exposure. She always assumed I was too compliant to ever turn those legal weapons against her. I looked at her face contorted with rage, and then I shifted my gaze to Savannah. My older sister was currently hyperventilating against the edge of a guest table, grasping the white linen tablecloth just to remain standing. She looked pathetic, stripped of the unearned medical prestige she always flaunted over me. "You did not need liquidity, Mother," I replied. My voice remained remarkably calm, offering a chilling contrast to her hysterical screaming. "You needed a host." I let that word hang in the quiet air, allowing the wealthy spectators to fully digest the reality of her financial crimes. I spent my entire adolescence acting as the silent, invisible foundation for this family. You leveraged my inheritance to buy your designer gowns and fund Savannah's Boston clinic while treating my career like a trivial inconvenience. You fed on my assets to project an illusion of wealth you never actually earned. I took one step closer, invading her personal space. Evelyn flinched, taking a small, involuntary step backward. "But this parasite has been surgically removed," I continued. "I legally severed the arteries connecting my future to your debt. I built a corporate fortress around my assets that you can never penetrate. And because you were so greedy that you sent Savannah to force a fraudulent withdrawal, you just signed your own death warrant." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but her throat produced no sound. Her brilliant, manipulative mind could not find a single tactical exit from the corner I painted her into. "You did not just lose my money tonight, Mother," I said, lowering my voice to a sharp, lethal register. "You triggered a manual audit on your unsecured loans. The bank system recognized the missing collateral the exact second Savannah submitted those withdrawal slips." The concept of a manual audit finally penetrated Evelyn's stubborn ego. She spent decades hiding her fraudulent ledgers from institutional scrutiny. She knew the commercial lending division at Cherry Creek Bank possessed zero tolerance for unsecured liabilities. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped and her chest caved inward as the oxygen seemingly left her lungs. Aunt Marie sat at the second table watching the systematic dismantling of her sister with quiet approval. She raised her glass of sparkling water, taking a small, appreciative sip. She understood the flawless legal mechanics of my retaliation. By restructuring the trust, I committed no crime. I merely protected my own property. My mother and sister were the ones who committed the hostile act, and their own greed provided the exact legal justification required to bankrupt them. The high-altitude facade was completely annihilated. There were no more polite smiles or curated anecdotes about family loyalty. The ugly, terrifying truth lay exposed under the bright chandeliers. Evelyn and Savannah stood in the center of the dance floor, ruined and humiliated in front of the exact peer group they sacrificed my happiness to impress. I stood tall in my wedding gown, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation radiating through my veins. I did not raise my voice again. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology. I simply delivered the undeniable facts of their destruction. The climax had reached its peak, leaving a profound, echoing stillness in its wake. But this silence was merely the retreating tide, preparing for a much larger wave. I knew the automated banking systems operated with relentless speed. The global freeze was already actively locking their accounts across the state. I watched Evelyn's hands begin to tremble, anticipating the moment the digital shockwave finally breached the walls of this ballroom. The heavy stillness lingering over the dance floor was absolute. It felt as though the entire ballroom had been submerged underwater. The hired musicians held their instruments in suspended animation. The wealthy spectators remained frozen in their chairs. That suffocating quiet lasted for exactly 12 seconds before the digital avalanche commenced. It began with a sharp trilling sound emanating from Evelyn's beaded clutch. The sudden noise sliced through the tension like a scalpel. My mother flinched. She looked down at the small bag resting on the white linen tablecloth as if it contained a venomous snake. A fraction of a second later, a deep, resonant chime echoed from the far side of the room. My father, Thomas, stood near the terrace doors holding a glass of aged bourbon. Thomas always fashioned himself as a visionary real estate tycoon. In reality, he was merely a charismatic salesman. He spent his prime years shaking hands on exclusive golf courses and selling the illusion of high-altitude luxury to foreign investors. He never bothered to look at a balance sheet or calculate an interest rate. He left the dirty mechanics of funding to Evelyn and, by extension, to my forced labor. Now he reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket with a trembling hand, pulling out his smartphone. Before Thomas could even unlock his screen, a third device erupted. Savannah's mobile phone shrieked from inside her designer purse. The chaotic, frantic ringtone clashed violently against the sophisticated ambiance of the country club. The synchronized ringing echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a digital death knell. It was not a coincidence. It was not family members calling to offer congratulations on my nuptials. It was their creditors. The commercial lending division at Cherry Creek Bank operated with a ruthless, automated efficiency. When Savannah triggered the security protocol, the banking servers initiated a global freeze on every single entity registered under the Henry portfolio. The sudden evaporation of my historic trust revealed a catastrophic lack of underlying equity. That missing collateral instantly activated the default clauses buried deep within their massive commercial loans. I watched my mother slowly open her clutch. Her fingers lacked their usual elegant grace. They fumbled against the delicate clasp. She extracted her device and tapped the screen. She utilized a premium wealth management application to monitor her daily finances. She checked that specific application every morning with the devotion of a religious zealot worshiping the rising digits of her fabricated net worth. Tonight, the application delivered a very different sermon. Evelyn stared at the glowing screen, watching the pristine white interface transform. A series of urgent push notifications cascaded down the display, tinted in a harsh, glaring crimson. The alerts detailed the systematic execution of their financial empire. The operating accounts for their luxury ski chalets in Aspen were instantly locked. The corporate cards used to lease their imported European vehicles were suspended due to a critical covenant breach. Even the routing numbers tied to their exclusive Cherry Creek Country Club membership dues were blocked, preventing any further outgoing transactions. The bank recognized that their debt-to-income ratio had plunged into an irrecoverable deficit. In modern American finance, lenders do not wait for a formal bankruptcy hearing to protect their capital. When a borrower violates a primary liquidity covenant, the institution possesses the immediate legal right to seize control of all cross-collateralized assets. The software executed the seizure with cold mathematical precision. My father stared at his own device near the terrace doors. The glass of bourbon slipped from his grip. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending amber liquid and crystal shards scattering across the polished wood. He did not even flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. The charismatic armor he wore for decades melted away, leaving behind a pale, terrified old man who just realized he owned absolutely nothing. The payoff unfolding before my eyes was incredibly poetic and devastatingly realistic. For 10 years, I warned them about the dangers of over-leveraging their properties. I drafted extensive legal memos begging them to decouple my inheritance from their reckless investments. They ignored my professional advice, treating my caution as a symptom of weakness. They believed their sheer arrogance could outsmart federal banking regulations. By attempting to rob me during my wedding toasts, Evelyn handed the bank the exact legal justification required to dismantle her fraudulent kingdom. If she had simply allowed me to marry David in peace, the automated quarterly audit would not have occurred for another 2 weeks. They could have enjoyed 14 more days of imported wine and society galas, but her insatiable greed demanded immediate satisfaction. Her urgent whispered command to Savannah served as the spark that ignited the powder keg. The guests seated around the perimeter of the dance floor watched the spectacle in horrified fascination. Denver old money operates on a strict code of discretion. Wealthy families encounter financial difficulties all the time, but they handle those crises behind closed doors, with teams of expensive attorneys. To witness a prominent dynasty evaporate in real time under the bright chandeliers of a wedding reception was unprecedented. The tech heirs and the oil tycoons did not offer their assistance. They did not step forward to console Evelyn or offer Thomas a lifeline. They sat in their chairs acting as a silent jury. They watched the Henry family plummet from the pinnacle of the social hierarchy, knowing that the contagion of bankruptcy was highly infectious. By tomorrow morning, my parents would be entirely excommunicated from this elite circle. Their country club peers would stop returning their calls. Their invitations to charity galas would mysteriously vanish in the mail. Their social currency was dropping to zero right alongside their bank balances. Aunt Marie picked up her water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. Her dark eyes tracked the panic spreading across her sister's face. Marie recognized the finality of the situation. There were no legal loopholes left to exploit. There were no hidden offshore accounts to access. I had mapped every single vulnerability in their portfolio and engineered a collapse that offered zero avenues for escape. Evelyn tried to swipe away the crimson notifications, but the wealth management application locked her out entirely. The screen shifted to a stark gray background displaying a single phone number for the corporate liquidations department. She tapped the screen frantically, her polished acrylic nails clicking against the reinforced glass. The application refused to respond. The digital doors were bolted shut from the inside. She looked up from her phone. Her eyes darted around the ballroom, searching for a friendly face. She looked at the mayor of Denver, hoping his political influence could somehow reverse a federal banking protocol. The mayor immediately averted his gaze, staring intently at his dessert plate. He wanted zero association with a family currently undergoing a public financial execution. The sheer magnitude of the loss finally settled over the head table. The opulent floral arrangements, the custom silk drapery, and the towering tiered wedding cake suddenly felt like props on a sinking ship. The artificial wealth that defined my parents' existence was gone, leaving behind a massive, unpayable mountain of high-interest debt. I remained standing next to my chair, holding my head high. I felt the profound, weightless relief of a prisoner watching the jailhouse burn to the ground. I did not need to raise my voice or hurl bitter accusations to inflict damage. The truth was performing the heavy lifting for me. The synchronized ringing of the phones eventually stopped as the calls were routed to automated voicemails. The silence returned, but it possessed a different texture. It was no longer the quiet anticipation of a trap springing shut. It was the desolate, hollow stillness of a graveyard following a massacre. Savannah stood trembling near the center of the dance floor. She clutched her phone, staring at the identical red notifications glowing on her own display. She slowly lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face turned away from me and locked directly onto Evelyn. The realization of who was truly responsible for this catastrophe began to ignite a new, volatile fire behind her eyes. The golden child was realizing she had been sacrificed on the altar of her mother's greed, and the impending confrontation promised to be vicious. The psychological breakdown of the golden child did not occur in gradual stages. It was an instantaneous and catastrophic shattering. Savannah lowered her glowing smartphone and locked her red-rimmed eyes directly onto our mother. The full, terrifying realization washed over her like a freezing tidal wave. She was no longer a wealthy heiress operating a prestigious Boston dermatology clinic. She was now an active participant in a defaulted financial nightmare. The immense, unearned privilege she wore like an impenetrable protective cloak dissolved into thin air, leaving her entirely exposed to the harsh elements of reality. Her chest heaved dramatically as the raw, unforgiving oxygen of truth flooded her lungs. "You told me it was safe," Savannah shrieked. The piercing, erratic pitch of her voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers and shattered the last remaining ounce of dignity inside the Cherry Creek Country Club ballroom. She stepped away from the guest tables and marched toward the head table, pointing an accusatory, trembling finger straight at Evelyn. "You swore to me the money was sitting right there. You promised the transfer would take 5 minutes." Evelyn recoiled as if she had been struck with a physical blow. The matriarch, who spent her entire adulthood cultivating an aura of untouchable high society grace, found herself publicly cornered by her own creation. "Lower your voice this instant," Evelyn hissed, leaning her weight over the heavy linen-draped table. "People are watching us. We will handle this minor misunderstanding in private." "There is no private anymore," Savannah sobbed. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, ruining her expensive cosmetic application. Dark streaks of mascara stained her face, destroying the flawless aesthetic she prized above all else. "They locked my operating accounts. I cannot pay my nurses tomorrow morning. The bank is seizing the clinic." The toxic alliance that ruled our family for decades tore apart right in front of 300 influential witnesses. For years, Evelyn and Savannah operated as a unified, impenetrable front. They bonded over their shared vanity and their mutual disdain for my quiet, pragmatic career. My mother cultivated Savannah's arrogance, feeding her a constant diet of unearned praise, while treating my legal expertise as a limitless public utility. They believed their bond was unbreakable because it was forged in the fires of shared superiority. Now that superiority was bankrupt. The foundation of their relationship consisted entirely of stolen money and leverage. When the money vanished, the affection evaporated instantly. Savannah did not offer her mother grace or understanding in this moment of crisis. She offered pure, unadulterated venom. "You told me it was her fault we were struggling," Savannah yelled, gesturing wildly in my direction, while maintaining her furious glare on Evelyn. "You sat in my kitchen in Boston and told me Clara was hoarding the grandfather trust out of spite. You said she was trying to sabotage my clinic because she was jealous of my medical degree." A low collective murmur rolled through the seated guests. The Denver elite thrived on whispered gossip, but they rarely witnessed such a naked display of familial treachery. The tech executives and real estate developers exchanged wide-eyed glances, setting their dessert spoons down in unison. They were watching a high-altitude dynasty cannibalize itself over a plate of chocolate mousse. Evelyn's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. The exposure of her specific lies stripped away her last remaining psychological defense. She could not blame a banking error or a simple miscommunication. Her own favored daughter was broadcasting her deceit to the entire room. In a desperate bid to reclaim control over the narrative, Evelyn lashed out physically. She reached across the towering floral centerpiece and slapped Savannah's pointed hand away with a loud, sharp smack that resonated across the dance floor. "Show some respect," Evelyn screamed, her voice finally breaking the barrier of a hushed whisper. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself in front of the mayor. I gave you everything. I built your entire life. You will not stand there and humiliate me over a clerical banking delay." "A clerical delay," Savannah laughed, producing a harsh, hysterical sound that bordered on pure madness. "We are ruined. The Aspen houses are gone. My clinic is gone. We owe them millions of dollars and we have nothing left to leverage." The family dynamic collapsed under the crushing weight of its own deception. Siblings vying for power and parents exposed for their relentless exploitation. The very core of the Henry family drama had ruptured, spilling its toxic contents across the polished parquet wood. Thomas remained frozen near the terrace doors, staring at his broken bourbon glass, offering zero support to his warring wife and daughter. He was a hollow figurehead, incapable of leading a family through a genuine crisis. He simply stood there, watching the women tear each other to shreds. I stood beside David, watching the chaos unfold with pure clinical detachment. I did not feel a sudden rush of pity for my older sister. I did not experience a pang of guilt for my mother. I felt nothing but the clean, sterile satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. Every old issue of financial abuse, every quiet insult hurled at my profession, every stolen dollar used to fund their vanity was resolved in this singular, catastrophic moment. For a decade, they treated me like a silent, obedient workhorse. They expected me to audit their fraudulent tax returns and sign my name to their reckless commercial loans. They assumed my loyalty was a permanent, unchangeable fixture in their lives. They failed to realize that a private trust attorney understands the concept of a bad investment better than anyone else. I audited my own family, and I determined they were a massive liability I could no longer afford to carry. David shifted his weight, resting a reassuring solid hand on the small of my back. He did not speak. His silent presence offered a stark, comforting contrast to the screaming match occurring 10 feet away. Our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared strategy. We did not need to raise our voices or hurl insults to understand each other. We built our foundation on solid ground, while my family chose to build their castle on a fault line. Evelyn stood behind the table, her chest heaving rapidly as she glared at Savannah. The realization of their new, bleak reality began to settle over the warring duo. They were completely and utterly ruined. They possessed no hidden offshore assets to liquidate. They lacked the professional skills required to rebuild a fortune from scratch. They had spent their entire lives living off the labor of others, and now the well was permanently dry. Most devastating of all, they had no one to blame but themselves. I did not steal their money. I did not forge their signatures on a loan document. I merely moved my own property into a secure holding facility governed by Delaware law. Their own insatiable greed drove them to commit the fatal error. If Evelyn had not ordered the wedding day heist, the bank would not have initiated the emergency risk audit. If Savannah had not marched into the lobby demanding a fraudulent wire transfer, the automated security protocol would have remained dormant. They handed the executioner the axe and willingly placed their own heads on the chopping block. The guests continued to watch in stunned silence, sipping their ice water and absorbing the unprecedented spectacle. The high society peers they worshipped were currently acting as the silent jury for their social execution. The opulent reception had transformed into a luxurious courtroom where the verdict was already decided. The screaming eventually subsided into a tense, heavy silence. Savannah stood trembling, her face buried in her hands, weeping openly over the loss of her unearned kingdom. Evelyn stared blankly at the ruined floral arrangements, her mind desperately searching for a non-existent escape route. The immediate financial threat was neutralized, but a new, unexpected conflict instantly emerged from the ashes of their reputation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open once again. A stern-looking man wearing a dark-tailored suit stepped through the main entrance. He was clearly not a wedding guest. He wore a small, discreet earpiece and carried a thick leather portfolio under his arm. He bypassed the welcome table and walked directly toward the head table with the unmistakable, purposeful stride of a corporate process server. The electronic financial freeze was merely the digital precursor to the harsh physical reality of corporate liquidation. The commercial lending division was not just locking their accounts from afar. The institution was sending its legal representatives to claim their collateral in person, and they were starting with the very event we were currently attending. The man in the dark tailored suit did not hesitate. He moved with the precise mechanical efficiency of a corporate grim reaper. He stepped directly onto the elevated platform of the head table, bypassing the sprawling floral centerpieces and the towering tiered wedding cake. He did not care that he was interrupting a high society reception. He represented the commercial lending division of Cherry Creek Bank, and his presence signaled the absolute termination of the Henry family dynasty. He stopped in front of Thomas and Evelyn. He reached into his thick leather portfolio and extracted a dense stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue clip. He dropped the paperwork directly onto my mother's pristine white dinner plate. The thick packet landed with a solid, definitive thud, echoing the finality of their ruin. He spoke in a loud, clear baritone, announcing that the institution was initiating an immediate asset seizure, encompassing all commercial properties, luxury vehicles, and club memberships tied to their defaulted portfolio. My father stared at the legal summons as if it were a live explosive. Evelyn opened her mouth, producing a breathless, choking sound. The facade was permanently eradicated. The Denver elite seated across the ballroom watched the physical manifestation of bankruptcy descend upon their hosts. I stood mere feet away, observing the total annihilation of my abusers. A lesser person might have taken this opportunity to gloat. A petty individual might have grabbed the microphone from the master of ceremonies to deliver a victorious, mocking speech. I did not yell. I did not hurl a single insult. I did not demand an apology for the decades of emotional neglect and financial exploitation I survived. I learned a crucial lesson during my career as a senior wealth advisor. True, undeniable power in these hostile situations does not come from a screaming match. True power is the absolute, permanent withdrawal of your engagement. It is the realization that your opponent is no longer worthy of your energy, your anger, or your time. I turned my body away from the wreckage of my parents. I looked at David. My new husband stood beside me, projecting a quiet, immovable strength. He was not staring at the disgraced family or the corporate process server. His warm, grounding gaze was focused entirely on me. A soft, proud smile rested on his lips. He understood the monumental psychological shift occurring inside my mind. "Are you ready to leave?" I asked. My voice was gentle, completely devoid of the chaotic venom spilling across the other side of the table. David did not answer with words. He simply nodded and offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, resting my palm against the fine, dark fabric of his tailored suit jacket. Together, we turned our backs on the screaming matriarch and the weeping golden child. We took our first synchronized steps away from the toxic anchor that held me down for 27 years. We stepped down from the elevated head table, descending onto the polished parquet dance floor. The sprawling ballroom lay before us. The 300 influential guests who previously cheered our union were now frozen in varying states of shock. As David and I walked forward, the crowd instinctively parted. They moved their chairs aside, creating a wide, unobstructed path toward the heavy oak exit doors. We walked through the center of Colorado society. The suffocating silence of the room fractured, giving way to a rising tide of furious, frantic whispering. I could hear the rapid exchange of vicious gossip spreading through the echelons of the Cherry Creek elite. A prominent tech executive leaned into his wife's ear, murmuring about the immediate cancellation of a joint venture with my father. A local socialite frantically texted her country club board members, initiating the process to revoke my mother's exclusive membership. The social execution was happening in real time. The wealthy spectators were not offering sympathy. They were actively constructing quarantine zones to protect their own reputations from the infectious disease of the Henry family bankruptcy. I walked through the parting sea of guests holding my head high. The heavy silk train of my custom wedding gown glided smoothly across the hardwood floor, sweeping away the ashes of my past. As we approached the second row of tables, Aunt Marie caught my eye. My brilliant godmother remained seated, but her posture was impeccably straight. She did not speak. She simply raised her crystal glass of sparkling water, lifting it toward the ceiling in a slow, deliberate salute. Her dark eyes sparkled with profound, fierce validation. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of a battle flawlessly planned and ruthlessly won. I offered her a small, respectful nod in return, knowing she would handle the legal fallout with her usual judicial grace. We continued our march toward the exit. The heavy wooden doors grew closer with every steady step. Suddenly, a piercing, desperate shriek tore through the ambient whispering of the ballroom. "Clara!" It was Evelyn. Her voice lacked any trace of its former arrogant authority. It was a raw, pathetic wail of sheer desperation. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. "Clara, you have to fix this," she screamed. The sound of her expensive heels stumbled across the elevated stage behind us. "You know the lending director at the bank. You know the corporate liquidators. Call your contacts. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Stop them from taking the Aspen houses." Her demands echoed across the vaulted ceiling, exposing the deepest layer of her parasitic nature. Even in the absolute depths of her own self-inflicted destruction, she expected me to serve as her shield. She demanded that I deploy my professional reputation and my legal expertise to salvage the fraudulent empire she built by stealing my inheritance. She still viewed me as a disposable utility, designed solely to ensure her comfort. "Clara, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "You cannot just leave us here." I felt a brief, fleeting echo of the old guilt try to surface in my chest. For 2 decades, I was conditioned to turn around and clean up their messes. I was programmed to sacrifice my own peace to maintain their artificial happiness. But that version of Clara Henry died the moment Savannah tried to wire my future into an offshore holding account. I did not look back. I had spent 27 years looking back. I spent my entire youth checking my rearview mirror, anticipating the next financial disaster my parents would create. I was done living in the past. My eyes remained firmly locked on the exit and the man walking steadily beside me. David reached forward and pushed the heavy brass handles of the grand ballroom doors. The thick oak panels swung outward, revealing the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the country club. The crisp, cool air of the Colorado evening drifted inside, offering a refreshing contrast to the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the reception. We stepped across the threshold. The transition felt like crossing a physical border between 2 entirely different dimensions. Behind us, the chaotic bickering of the Henry family devolved into a feral screaming match. Savannah was shrieking at the process server, while Evelyn continued to wail my name into the uncaring void of the Denver elite. As the heavy oak doors swung shut on their automatic hinges, the frantic sounds of their ruin were instantly muffled. The heavy wood severed the audio connection, clipping Evelyn's final desperate plea in half. We left the parasitic remains of my abusers to drown in their own financial and social destruction. The grand ballroom was no longer a venue for a wedding celebration. It was a sealed tomb for a fabricated dynasty. David and I walked down the long carpeted hallway alone. The silence enveloping us was not heavy or tense. It was the pure, unadulterated quiet of absolute liberation. We were heading toward the valet stand, preparing to step into a future that belonged entirely to us. The trap had worked perfectly, but the most satisfying part of the evening was still waiting for me inside the digital dashboard of my new corporate holding account. The transition from the opulent country club into the crisp mountain evening felt like waking from a prolonged fever dream. As David and I walked beneath the grand stone archway, marking the main entrance of the Cherry Creek estate, a rush of cool Colorado air washed over my bare shoulders. The ambient temperature had dropped significantly since the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The sudden chill did not make me shiver. Instead, it acted as a clarifying force, sweeping away the lingering scent of expensive perfume and catered cuisine that clung to my wedding gown. A uniformed valet stood near the illuminated cobblestone driveway, holding the keys to our waiting town car. He maintained a respectful distance, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere. The muffled sounds of the reception remained trapped behind the thick stone walls of the venue. Out here, under the expansive night sky, the world was tranquil and infinitely vast. David handed the attendant a generous gratuity, exchanging a brief polite nod before opening the heavy rear door of the sleek black sedan. I gathered the voluminous silk folds of my skirt and stepped into the vehicle. The interior smelled of polished leather and quiet efficiency. The doors shut with a solid, definitive click, sealing us inside a private, insulated sanctuary. The driver engaged the engine and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb. Through the tinted rear window, I watched the sprawling clubhouse shrink into the distance. The grand columns and the glowing terrace lights faded into the shadows, becoming nothing more than a minor speck against the sprawling canvas of the mountains. I reached into the small beaded handbag resting on my lap and retrieved my smartphone. The device felt smooth and cool against my palm. Unlike my mother's phone, which was currently drowning in a flood of catastrophic alerts, my screen displayed a serene, uncluttered interface. I opened the encrypted financial application connected to my Delaware registration. I utilized a dual authentication process, pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner to unlock the portal. The digital dashboard materialized in a wash of soft blue light, illuminating the dark cabin of the town car. I stared at the central ledger, admiring the flawless mathematical architecture I had spent months constructing. My corporate trust was secure. The assets were safely quarantined within a blind structural entity, shielding them from any external claims or familial interference. There were no flashing warnings or margin calls on this screen. There was only the steady, relentless upward progression of an automated wealth model I designed from scratch. The algorithms were compounding quietly in the background, allocating resources across diversified index funds and municipal bonds. The system functioned with a beautiful, predictable logic entirely removed from the chaotic emotional extortion that defined my parents' erratic investments. I watched the numbers tick upward a fraction of a percent, representing a future that was undeniable and real. I locked the screen and placed the device back into my bag. I turned my head to look at the man sitting beside me. David rested his arm along the back of the leather seat, offering a steady, calming presence. He did not ask for a recap of the confrontation. He did not press me for details regarding Evelyn's final, pathetic demands. We had spent countless evenings preparing for this exact outcome, analyzing every potential variable and risk factor. The operation had executed perfectly, matching our projections down to the final decimal point. Our future together belonged entirely to us. We were completely insulated from the toxic undercurrent that poisoned my childhood. We did not need to dedicate our upcoming weekends to untangling fraudulent tax returns or mitigating the fallout from Savannah's impulsive spending habits. We were free to build a life founded on transparency and mutual respect. The heavy burden of protecting a parasitic dynasty had been permanently lifted from my shoulders, leaving behind a vast, open horizon. The realization of the timeline struck me with a profound sense of awe. 45 minutes. That was the total duration of the collapse. The Henry family spent 3 decades constructing an empire of rust and lies, leveraging social status and false promises to inflate their standing in Denver society. They manipulated relationships and exploited my obedience to sustain a fragile illusion of untouchable prestige. Yet their entire kingdom crumbled into dust in less than an hour. The destruction did not arrive via a vicious, unprovoked attack. I did not hire saboteurs or spread malicious rumors to ruin their reputation. The fatal blow was delivered by the simple, impenetrable force of a boundary enforced by law. I merely drew a strict legal line around my own property and refused to let them cross it. Their own insatiable greed propelled them over the edge. By trying to breach that boundary, they activated the institutional traps that led directly to their demise. The tragedy and the suffering of my early years felt distant now. For so long I carried the deep aching loss of a mother who viewed me as a utility and a sister who treated me as a rival. I spent my youth navigating a house filled with conditional love and financial coercion. I learned to survive by remaining quiet and observant, absorbing their cruelty while secretly mastering the tools required to dismantle their leverage. Tonight, all of that pain transformed into a calculated, breathtaking liberation. The emotional scars no longer represented a source of shame. They were the defining lessons that taught me how to construct an unbreakable fortress. The adversity forged my intellect and sharpened my resolve, turning a quiet, compliant daughter into a formidable private trust attorney capable of orchestrating a flawless legal victory. I leaned my head against David's shoulder, finding comfort in the solid rhythm of his breathing. The soft hum of the tires gliding over the asphalt provided a soothing background melody. I looked out the passenger window, watching the towering silhouettes of the Rocky Mountains roll past. The sky above the peaks was pristine and clear, scattered with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. The constellations offered a timeless, indifferent beauty, far removed from the petty squabbles of the country club elite. I took a deep, slow breath, drawing the clean, cool air deep into my lungs. For the first time in 27 years, my chest felt entirely unburdened. I was no longer a human safety net. I was no longer a hostage to the Henry legacy. I breathed the air of a woman who owed absolutely nothing to anyone in this world. I held the keys to my own unbreakable empire, and the road ahead was wide open. The town car navigated the winding mountain road, carrying us further away from the wreckage. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, committing the physical sensations of this victory to memory. True independence is a rare commodity. Many people inherit fortunes, but remain forever chained to the expectations of their ancestors. Others build towering companies, but become slaves to their own greedy ambitions. I had navigated the treacherous middle ground, securing my legacy while simultaneously burning the chains that bound me to a toxic past. My grandfather would have understood this maneuver. He built his wealth through authentic labor and pragmatic strategy. He intended his legacy to provide security, not to subsidize a theatrical charade. By stripping Evelyn and Thomas of their unearned access, I was honoring his original intent. I was returning the capital to a state of purposeful growth, restoring the integrity of the assets they tried to squander. The money would no longer serve as a tool for manipulation. It would serve as a foundation for genuine stability. The headlights of the sedan illuminated the dark asphalt, cutting a bright, clear path through the shadows of the pine forest. The journey down the mountain was smooth and unimpeded. David shifted slightly, wrapping his arm around my waist and pulling me closer. The warmth of his embrace reinforced the reality of my new existence. We were a united front, equipped with the knowledge and the resources to weather any future storm. I opened my eyes and watched the reflection of the stars in the tinted glass. The chaotic noise of my previous life was permanently silenced, replaced by the serene quiet of a well-executed plan. The dramatic heist my mother attempted had failed spectacularly, yielding the exact opposite of her intended result. Instead of securing her fraudulent reign, she inadvertently handed me the crown. I smiled into the darkness, embracing the profound peace of a closed chapter. The narrative of my exploitation was finished, and the story of my unburdened empire was just beginning. The tale of Clara Henry is far more than a calculated financial maneuver executed in the shadows of a country club. It is a profound mirror held up to the fractured soul of the modern American family. We are raised in a society that reveres the home as a sacred sanctuary, the absolute bedrock of traditional values. Yet beneath the polished oak tables of our elite enclaves and the manicured lawns of suburban estates, a silent epidemic of conditional love is actively destroying our most cherished institution. Clara's journey forces us to look past the velvet curtains and confront a devastating reality. It asks us to examine what happens when the very people entrusted to nurture and protect your future decide to consume it instead. To the parents of America, this narrative offers a stark, unforgiving reckoning regarding the true nature of family responsibility. We live in a culture that increasingly equates a child's fundamental worth with their outward prestige. We measure success by Ivy League degrees, medical titles, corner offices, and the aesthetic perfection of a curated life. In this relentless, dizzying pursuit of social currency, the foundational pillars of traditional parenting, honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness are being quietly replaced by greed and optics. We witness parents cultivating golden children to serve as trophies while simultaneously reducing their other children to mere utilities, quiet financial and emotional safety nets designed to be exploited. From a spiritual perspective, observing our modern social reality through the ancient lens of the Tao, this dynamic represents the ultimate failure of self-cultivation. When a parent's ego becomes inextricably tethered to the ephemeral illusions of wealth and status, they lose the capacity to truly see the soul of their child. True traditional education does not begin with forcing your children into prestigious molds. It begins with parents repairing their own internal moral compass. The universe operates on an absolute law of balance. If you do not cultivate your own wisdom, your own ethical boundaries, and your own internal resilience, you will inevitably cannibalize the people who love you the most. You will sacrifice their peace to feed your vanity, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, decaying ashes of a fabricated dynasty. To the young adults and the silent, dutiful children navigating these turbulent waters, Clara's story serves as a breathtaking masterclass in profound self-rescue. The traditional virtue of filial piety is a beautiful, necessary concept in any functional society, but it was never intended to be a suicide pact. When family loyalty requires the daily sacrifice of your mental peace, your financial future, and your fundamental human dignity, it ceases to be loyalty. It becomes captivity. You are constantly taught to endure, to turn the other cheek, and to endlessly absorb the shockwaves created by the broken systems of your elders. However, true spiritual cultivation requires you to forge a different path. You must develop the piercing wisdom to recognize deception even when it wears the face of your own mother. You must cultivate the unshakable morality to refuse participation in a lie, regardless of the societal pressure demanding your compliance. Most importantly, you must build the fierce, quiet willpower to enforce impenetrable boundaries. Notice that Clara did not scream in that ballroom. She did not seek physical vengeance or hurl bitter insults. She simply withdrew her energy. She gathered her intellect, mastered the rules of the system they used to trap her, and engineered her own liberation. Your greatest responsibility in this life is not to save parents who vehemently refuse to save themselves. Your responsibility is to cultivate your own character so deeply that you become immune to their manipulation. Looking at the broader canvas of society, the collapse of the Henry family is not a tragedy. It is a natural, necessary correction of the universe. The Tao teaches us that whatever is rigid, artificial, and overly bloated by ego will eventually snap under its own weight, while that which is grounded, quiet, and true will endure the harshest storms. Our modern society desperately needs individuals to stop chasing the hollow validation of the crowd and start turning their gaze inward. By repairing our own flaws, confronting our own hidden greed, and nurturing a quiet, unshakable inner strength, we create a life of genuine beauty and purpose. Clara's ultimate victory was not the freezing of the commercial bank accounts or the public humiliation of her abusers. Her true victory was the pristine, unburdened air she breathed in the back of that town car. She found the way of peace by simply letting the heavy, rotting things fall away. These are the intricate narratives that challenge us to reflect deeply on the unseen currents shaping our own lives, our relationships, and our quietest fears. If this story resonates with the silent battles you are fighting behind closed doors, I invite you to subscribe and follow Morning Revenge. Join us as we continue to explore the complex, often messy realities of human nature, the pursuit of justice, and the immense courage it takes to finally reclaim your own narrative. We are raised on the absolute maxim that family is everything, a cultural mandate insisting that blood is an unbreakable bond, demanding infinite, unconditional forgiveness. But perhaps that is the most dangerous, paralyzing lie we have ever been sold. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer a deeply toxic family is not to endlessly save them, but to step aside and let them completely collapse. Only when they are forcefully stripped of their enablers, their stolen resources, and their artificial prestige are they finally forced to sit in the quiet, desolate ruins and meet themselves. Clara did not destroy her family. She simply handed them the mirror they had been avoiding for decades. As you look at the reflections in your own life, you must ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you the one holding the fragile, jagged glass together with your own bleeding hands? Or are you finally ready to drop it and walk free?